Lila Moore stared at the ceiling of her small apartment, her thoughts drifting between the faint sounds of the city and the echo of memories from her past. The clock ticked methodically on the nightstand, a reminder of the passing time, a constant, unrelenting march forward. Today marked her 50th birthday, a milestone she never imagined she would reach in this way. The thought didn't carry the weight of celebration, nor did it bring the sorrow that others might feel about aging. Instead, it filled her with something else, a quiet, determined sense of triumph. She swung her legs out of bed and stood up slowly, stretching her arms above her head. The apartment was small but comfortable, a cozy refuge from the outside world. It had become her sanctuary, her safe space, after years of living a life that wasn't truly hers. 50 years. How strange it seemed to think about it now, how much life had changed. She had once been the wife of David Moore, a woman who lived in a large house, hosting dinner parties and playing the role of a dutiful wife to a man who hardly noticed her. But that life felt like a dream now, like a distant memory from another time. She wasn't that woman anymore, and she hadn't been for years. The kettle on the stove began to whistle, and Lila walked over to the kitchen, preparing her morning tea. She watched the steam curl up into the air, breathing in the warmth of it. It was a comforting ritual, one she had embraced ever since she'd moved into this apartment. In her previous life, there had been no time for rituals like this, no moments of quiet reflection, no chance to simply be. As she poured the hot water into her cup, she let her thoughts drift back to that life. 15 years had passed since everything had changed, since her world had come crashing down around her, forcing her to confront the painful truth she had been avoiding for too long. It all began when she was 35, still young enough to believe in the possibility of change, but old enough to have felt the sting of disappointment. She had been married to David for nearly a decade by then, and their life together seemed, at least on the surface, to be solid. They had a beautiful home, stable careers, and a marriage that appeared, from the outside, to be built on love and partnership. But beneath the surface, things were falling apart. Lila had known it for a while, but she hadn't wanted to admit it to herself, not fully, at least. She had clung to the idea that if she just worked a little harder, if she just tried a little more, things would get better. She had been wrong. The early years of Lila's marriage to David had been filled with promise. They had met in their mid-20s, and like so many couples, they had fallen in love quickly, swept up in the excitement of building a life together. David had been charming and ambitious, with a promising career in finance that seemed to be taking off. Lila, too, had her own dreams. She worked as a social worker, helping children and families in need, and she had imagined that one day, she and David would start a family of their own. For a while, that dream had seemed within reach. They had talked about having children, about buying a house in the suburbs, about the future they would build together. But as the years went by, those conversations became less frequent, and the dream of starting a family began to slip away. Lila had always wanted to be a mother, but no matter how hard she and David tried, they couldn't seem to conceive. They had gone through fertility treatments, each one more painful and disappointing than the last. Every time Lila walked into the doctor's office, she felt a pit in her stomach, a growing sense of dread that this time, too, would end in failure. And it had. Over and over again. The strain of it had worn Lila down in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had always considered herself strong, capable of handling whatever life threw at her. But the constant cycle of hope and disappointment, the physical and emotional toll of the treatments, and the growing sense of isolation had left her feeling hollow. She had felt like she was failing, not just as a woman, but as a wife. She knew that David wanted children, too, and though he never said it outright, she could sense his growing frustration. In the beginning, David had been supportive. He had gone to every doctor's appointment with her, held her hand during every procedure, and comforted her when things didn't go as planned. But as time went on, his patience seemed to wear thin. He threw himself into his work, staying late at the office, or taking on extra business trips. The conversations that had once flowed so easily between them became strained, filled with awkward silences and unspoken resentment. Lila tried to bridge the gap between them. She suggested vacations, weekend getaways, anything to recapture the intimacy they had once shared. But David always had an excuse. He was too busy with work, too tired, too preoccupied. Eventually, Lila stopped trying. It was easier to live in the silence than to confront the painful truth that their marriage was crumbling. Their 10th wedding anniversary had come and gone without much fanfare. David had bought her flowers and taken her out to dinner at a fancy restaurant, but the evening had felt hollow, like they were going through the motions of a marriage that no longer existed. When they got home that night, David had kissed her on the cheek and said, "Good night," before disappearing into his office. Lila had lain awake in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering where it had all gone wrong. She had once believed that love was enough to carry them through anything, but now she wasn't so sure. Was this all there was? Was this the life she was destined to live? And then, just when Lila thought things couldn't get worse, David's parents had moved in. Vera and Henry Moore were not easy people. Lila had known that from the moment she met them. Vera, in particular, had always made her feel small, as though she was never quite good enough for her son. "The more children you have, the better," Vera would say every time they saw each other, a pointed reminder that Lila had yet to give her a grandchild. For years, Vera and Henry had lived in a different city, and their visits had been infrequent. Lila had been able to manage the occasional tension-filled family gathering, knowing that it would only last a few days before Vera and Henry returned to their own home. But all of that changed when they decided to sell their house and move in with David and Lila permanently. The decision had come out of the blue. One afternoon, David had come home from work and casually announced, "Mom and Dad are going to stay with us for a while." Lila had stared at him in disbelief. "Stay with us? For how long?" David had shrugged. "I don't know. They're selling their house, so it might be a while." Lila had felt a surge of panic. She knew what a while meant. Vera and Henry were moving in, and they weren't planning on leaving anytime soon. "David, we need our own space," Lila had protested. "We're already struggling to connect, and having your parents here will only make things worse." But David had brushed off her concerns. "It'll be fine," he had said. "I'm hardly ever home, and you work full-time too. We won't even notice them." But Lila noticed. From the moment Vera and Henry moved in, they took over the house. Vera immediately began rearranging the kitchen, moving things around without asking, and criticizing Lila's cooking at every opportunity. "You know, David used to love my roast chicken," she would say with a saccharine smile as she watched Lila prepare dinner. "Maybe you should try my recipe sometime." Henry, meanwhile, seemed content to spend his days lounging in front of the television, watching sports and occasionally disappearing for nights out with friends. Lila hadn't thought much of Henry's outings at first, but as time went on, she began to suspect that his nights out weren't as innocent as he claimed. She had found receipts from nightclubs and business cards from bars in his pockets, and it didn't take much to figure out what Henry was really up to. But it was Vera who made Lila's life a living hell. At first, it was small things, like calling Lila by the name of David's ex-girlfriend, always apologizing afterward as if it were an innocent mistake. "I'm sorry, Lila," Vera would say sweetly. "I guess I just remember her so clearly, because she was David's first serious girlfriend." Lila had tried to believe that Vera's slip-ups were unintentional, but as the months went on, it became clear that Vera was doing it on purpose. Every time Lila did something around the house, Vera had something to say. Whether it was folding laundry the wrong way or not seasoning the food to Vera's liking, there was always a criticism. And David? David did nothing to stop it. Whenever Lila tried to talk to him about how Vera was treating her, he would brush off her concerns. "She's old, Lila," he would say. "She doesn't mean anything by it." But Lila knew better. Vera's actions were calculated, designed to undermine Lila and make her feel like an outsider in her own home. And with each passing day, Lila felt more and more trapped. As the months dragged on, Lila felt like she was living in a pressure cooker. Her home no longer felt like hers. She was constantly walking on eggshells, trying to avoid Vera's sharp tongue and Henry's disapproving glances. She had thought that living with David's parents would be difficult, but she hadn't anticipated just how suffocating it would be. David, for his part, seemed oblivious to the tension in the house. He spent more and more time at work, often staying late or traveling for business. Lila had tried to talk to him about the growing distance between them, but every time she brought it up, David would dismiss her concerns. "I'm busy, Lila," he would say. "I don't have time for this right now." But Lila had started to suspect that work wasn't the only thing keeping David away from home. One evening, after a particularly difficult day at work, Lila came home to find Vera and Henry sitting in the living room, watching television. They barely acknowledged her as she walked past them to the kitchen, her mind too preoccupied with exhaustion to engage in conversation. As she went to grab a glass of water from the fridge, something caught her eye, a piece of paper sticking out from under a pile of mail on the counter. It was an airline ticket, dated for a flight the previous weekend. The name on the ticket wasn't David's, but the woman's name was unmistakable. "Who is Emily?" Lila asked aloud, holding the ticket in her hand. Vera glanced up from the television, her eyes narrowing. "Oh, Emily," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "She's David's classmate. They've reconnected recently." Lila's heart pounded in her chest. "Reconnected? What do you mean?" Vera's smile widened. "Well, dear, they've been seeing each other for quite some time. I'm surprised David hasn't told you yet." Lila felt like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. She had suspected that David's late nights and frequent business trips weren't all work-related, but hearing it confirmed by Vera was a gut punch she wasn't prepared for. David was having an affair. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, leaving her breathless. She had spent years trying to make their marriage work, sacrificing her own happiness for the sake of their relationship, only to find out that David had betrayed her. "Why didn't you tell me?" Lila demanded, her voice trembling with anger. Vera shrugged. "It wasn't my place, dear. But I suppose it's good that you know now. David and Emily are planning to move in together once you're out of the picture." Lila's blood ran cold. "Once I'm out of the picture?" "Oh, don't be so dramatic," Vera said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "It's time for you to move on. David has." Lila stood there, clutching the airline ticket in her hand, feeling like her world was crumbling around her. David had not only betrayed her, but he had also enlisted his parents in his deceit. They had known all along, and they had kept it from her. But as the shock began to wear off, something else took its place: rage. Lila had spent years being treated like she didn't matter, like her feelings were insignificant. But not anymore. She wasn't going to let them walk all over her any longer. Later that evening, when David finally came home, Lila was waiting for him in the kitchen. The airline ticket sat on the table in front of her, a silent accusation. David looked surprised to see her sitting there. "What's going on?" he asked, glancing at the ticket. "Who is Emily?" Lila asked, her voice steady, despite the fury simmering beneath the surface. David's eyes flickered with recognition, and for a moment, Lila saw a flash of guilt on his face. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "She's a friend from college," he said, his tone dismissive. "A friend?" Lila repeated. "Is that what you call someone you're having an affair with?" David sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Lila, I didn't want you to find out this way." Lila's hands clenched into fists. You didn't want me to find out at all. David sat down across from her, his expression tired and resigned. It's been going on for a while, he admitted. I've been seeing her since just before I got promoted. We reconnected at a work event, and things just happened. Lila felt her chest tighten. How long have you been planning to leave me? David avoided her gaze. I'm not leaving you, Lila. I'm moving on. You should too. The words were like a slap to the face. Moving on? You're talking about this like it's nothing. Like I'm nothing. David finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. I'm not trying to hurt you, Lila. But this is just the way things are. Emily and I are serious. We want to be together, and I think it's time for you to accept that. Lila stared at him in disbelief. You think I should just accept that you've been cheating on me? That you've been planning to replace me with this other woman? David shrugged. It's not like that. It's exactly like that. Lila shouted, her voice breaking. You've been lying to me for years. You've been using me while you've been off with her. David's expression hardened. I didn't ask for this to happen, Lila. But it did. And now we have to deal with it. Lila felt like she was drowning, struggling to keep her head above water. She had spent years sacrificing for David, putting his needs before her own, trying to be the perfect wife. And this was her reward? A husband who had betrayed her, parents-in-law who had conspired against her, and a future that had been stolen from her? But as she sat there, staring at David, something inside her shifted. She wasn't going to be a victim any longer. She wasn't going to let David, Vera, and Henry dictate her life. If they thought they could cast her aside like she was nothing, they were wrong. Lila took a deep breath, her hand steadying. All right, she said quietly. I'll leave. But I'm not going without a fight. Underscore 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 underscore. Night for days after the confrontation with David, Lila felt a mixture of anger, grief, and determination. The bed felt too big, too empty, yet heavy with the weight of everything unsaid between her and David. She tossed and turned, the words he'd spoken echoing in her mind, I'm moving on. You should too. It wasn't the affair itself that cut the deepest. Of course, discovering that David had been unfaithful was a betrayal beyond what she had ever imagined. But it was the coldness, the sheer callousness in his voice when he talked about replacing her with this woman, this Emily. That was what left the deepest wound. For so long, Lila had poured everything she had into their marriage. She had sacrificed her own dreams of happiness to accommodate his needs, to support him through his career, to maintain a household that he could be proud of. And now, he was discarding her as if she were nothing more than a piece of furniture, something to be replaced when it no longer served its purpose. She had spent years keeping quiet, trying to be the good wife, the supportive daughter-in-law, even when Vera and Henry made her feel like she wasn't enough. But now, all of that seemed pointless. She had tried so hard to hold it all together, and for what? To be cast aside like she didn't matter? Lila knew that she couldn't simply leave without a fight. She couldn't let David win so easily. If he wanted to move on, then fine, but he wasn't going to do it without consequences. Lila had spent too many years of her life being pushed around, belittled, and ignored. Now, it was time for her to take control. As she lay in bed one sleepless night, a plan began to form in her mind. She would leave, but not before she took something back. She would take the things that were rightfully hers, the things she had earned through years of hard work and sacrifice. And if that left David scrambling, then so be it. But Lila's plan didn't stop there. She wasn't just going to take her things. She was going to take everything that mattered to David. The house, the furniture, the sense of control he had so carefully cultivated over the years, it was all going to be stripped away. The perfect opportunity came sooner than Lila expected. One evening, over a tense and quiet dinner, Dara casually mentioned that she and Henry were planning to attend a memorial service for a distant relative in Atlanta. They would be leaving early Saturday morning and returning late Sunday night. As soon as Vera said the words, Lila's mind started racing. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. With Vera and Henry gone for the weekend, Lila would have free reign over the house. She could execute her plan without interference. "Are you coming with us, David?" Dara asked, her voice softening as she looked at her son. David shook his head. "No, I've got too much work to catch up on. You and Dad go without me." Lila bit back a smile. Perfect. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Lila started making her preparations. She called a moving company and arranged for them to come on Sunday afternoon. She also contacted a garbage collection service to come by in the morning to take away anything that wasn't worth moving. Over the next few days, Lila quietly packed up her belongings, her clothes, her books, the few sentimental items she had kept over the years. She didn't want to take much, just enough to start fresh in a new place. Everything else, the furniture, the appliances, the things that David valued, she planned to leave behind, but not in the way David or his parents expected. By the time Saturday morning rolled around, Lila was ready. She watched from the window as Vera and Henry loaded their suitcases into the car, chatting happily as if everything in the world was perfectly normal. Lila felt a pang of resentment as she watched them go. They had never once treated her like family. They had always made her feel like an outsider, like someone who didn't belong. But soon, they would understand just how wrong they had been. As the car pulled out of the driveway, Lila took a deep breath. The house was quiet now. David was holed up in his office, no doubt working on something for his job, oblivious to what was about to happen. On Sunday morning, Lila awoke early. The house was still quiet, and the air felt heavy with anticipation. Today was the day. She walked into the kitchen and made herself a cup of tea, savoring the peacefulness of the morning. It felt strange, knowing that by the end of the day, everything would be different. She would be leaving this house, this life, behind for good. At 9 a.m., the garbage collection service arrived, right on schedule. Lila greeted the workers and directed them to the items she wanted removed, the old furniture, the broken appliances, the things that had cluttered the house for years but had never been repaired or replaced. As they hauled away the junk, Lila felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Each piece they took felt like a weight lifted from her shoulders, a burden she no longer had to carry. She had spent too many years living in a house filled with things that didn't bring her joy, things that belonged more to Vera and Henry than to her. Now, they were gone. By noon, the house was starting to feel empty, but Lila wasn't done yet. At 2 p.m., the moving company arrived. Lila had already packed up the few items she planned to take with her, and the movers quickly loaded them into the truck. But that wasn't all. Lila had one final task to complete before she left. As the movers worked, Lila walked through the house, taking one last look at the life she was leaving behind. The rooms were bare now, stripped of the things that had once filled them. The furniture was gone, the appliances were gone, even the curtains had been taken down. The house looked as hollow as she had felt for so many years. When the movers were finished, Lila stood in the empty living room, her heart pounding with anticipation. She had one last thing to do before she left. In the hallway closet, Lila found a small box labeled Important Papers. Inside, she found the deed to the house, the mortgage documents, and a stack of paperwork that Vera and Henry had kept for years. She took the box and walked out the front door, locking it behind her. As she drove away, Lila felt an overwhelming sense of relief. For the first time in years, she was free. David returned home later that evening, completely unaware of what had transpired in his absence. He had spent the day working in his office, focused on the tasks at hand, oblivious to the fact that his wife was in the process of dismantling their life. When he finally emerged from his office, the first thing he noticed was the silence. The house felt unusually quiet, almost eerily so. He walked into the living room and froze in his tracks. The room was empty. The furniture was gone. The sofa, the coffee table, the bookshelves, everything had disappeared. Panic surged through him as he rushed from room to room, only to find that the rest of the house was in the same state. The dining room table was missing, the bed had been stripped, the refrigerator was gone. Even the curtains had been taken down. David's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make sense of what had happened. He called out for Lila, but there was no response. The house was completely empty. It wasn't just the furniture that was missing, it was Lila. For a moment, David stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the empty space where their life had once been. He couldn't believe it. She had actually left. And not just left, she had taken everything with her. David's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his stupor. He pulled it out and saw that it was a message from Lila. "I'm gone. Don't try to find me. Good luck with the new life you wanted." David stared at the screen, his hands trembling. He had never imagined that Lila would actually leave, let alone take such drastic measures. He had thought she would fight, argue, cry, but leave? He had never seen that coming. He had wanted to move on with Emily, to start fresh, but now everything was gone. The next day, Vera and Henry returned from Atlanta, exhausted but content after the memorial service. As they pulled into the driveway, Vera noticed that something seemed off. The house looked different. "Why are the curtains down?" Vera asked, frowning as she squinted at the windows. Henry shrugged. Maybe Lila took them down to wash them. But when they opened the front door, Vera's suspicions were immediately confirmed. The house was empty. Vera gasped, her hand flying to her chest as she took in the sight of the bare living room. "What the? Where is everything?" Henry looked around, equally shocked. "What the hell happened here?" David came out of his office, his face pale. "She's gone," he said, his voice hollow. "Lila left. She took everything." Vera's face turned bright red with rage. "She did what?" She stormed into the empty living room, her heels clicking angrily against the hardwood floor. "How could she just leave? How could she do this to us?" David shrugged helplessly. "I don't know, Mom. She's gone." Vera turned on him, her eyes blazing. "How could you let this happen? You were supposed to be watching her. How could you let her destroy everything we built?" David had no answer. He had never imagined that Lila would do something like this. In all the years they had been married, she had never once stood up to him, never once defied him. But now everything was gone. Lila's new apartment was small, but it was perfect. It was a world away from the large, impersonal house she had shared with David and his parents. Here, she had space for herself, for her thoughts, for her dreams, for her freedom. She had found the apartment online, a small one-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and that was all that mattered. For the first time in years, Lila felt like she could breathe. She no longer had to walk on eggshells, no longer had to deal with the constant criticism from Vera or the emotional distance from David. She was free to live her life on her own terms. In the weeks that followed, Lila began to rebuild her life. She reconnected with old friends, joined a local book club, and started attending yoga classes at the community center. She even took up painting, a hobby she had abandoned years ago when life had gotten too busy. Her new job as a caregiver at a local retirement home brought her unexpected joy. The residents were kind and appreciative, and Lila found herself forming meaningful connections with them. She loved listening to their stories, learning from their experiences, and bringing a little light into their lives. One evening, as Lila sat on the balcony of her apartment, sipping tea and watching the sunset, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. She had done it. She had taken back control of her life. And for the first time in years, Lila felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. At 50 years old, Lila had finally found the freedom she had been searching for all her life. It hadn't come easily, she had fought for it, clawed her way through the pain and betrayal to get here. But now, as she sat in the quiet of her own space, she knew that every step had been worth it. She had left behind the life that had suffocated her, the people who had belittled and betrayed her, and in doing so, she had found something far more valuable, herself. For Lila Moore, life was just beginning.